Most people remember Cleopatra's death as a moment, a bite, a sudden end, a dramatic image preserved by history. But that isn't where Rome defeated her. By the time Cleopatra died, the damage had already been done, quietly, methodically, and long before her body failed. Rome didn't rush to kill her. It took something far more valuable first: her legitimacy, her alliances, her sense of control. What remained was a queen still breathing, but already dismantled. This isn't a story about romance or spectacle. It's an examination of a system, how an empire learned to conquer without always drawing a sword, how it broke its enemies psychologically before history ever called it victory. Because if Rome could do this to Cleopatra, what did it do to everyone else?
Rome did not begin its war against Cleopatra with ships or soldiers. It began with words. In the final years of the Republic, long before Alexandria fell, Cleopatra was already being defeated in another arena, one far more important to Rome than the battlefield: public perception. Power in Rome did not rest only on armies, it rested on legitimacy, on who was considered worthy of rule and who was not. And so Cleopatra was slowly redefined. In Roman speeches, she was no longer a monarch. In poems, she was no longer a ruler. In rumors whispered through the city, she became something else entirely: an intrusion, a corruption, a foreign presence poisoning Roman virtue from the outside. This process was not explosive, it was controlled, almost bureaucratic. Roman elites did not shout about Cleopatra, they repeated themselves about her, again and again, in the Senate, in letters, in public addresses. She was described as excessive, dangerous, unnatural, not because of what she had done, but because of what she represented. Cleopatra was a woman who ruled without Rome's permission. She commanded wealth Rome coveted. She spoke as an equal to Roman men who believed the world existed to obey them. That alone made her intolerable. But Rome understood something crucial. Killing a legitimate ruler creates martyrs. Discrediting one creates permission. So Cleopatra's image was softened first, then bent, then hollowed out. She was framed not as Queen of Egypt, but as a temptress who had ensnared Roman men, not as a political strategist, but as a moral threat. Roman propaganda leaned heavily on this transformation because it served a purpose. If Cleopatra could be reduced to appetite and indulgence, then her power no longer needed to be respected, it only needed to be contained. This was not accidental, it was precise. By portraying her as immoral, Rome removed her right to sympathy. By calling her foreign, Rome stripped her of legitimacy. By painting her as dangerous, Rome justified what would come next. And the most effective part of this strategy was its tone. There were no mass hysteria campaigns, no dramatic denunciations meant to shock. The language was calm, reasonable, almost dull. Cleopatra was spoken of as a problem, something that needed to be handled, a disruption to Roman order. In Roman poetry, she appeared as decadence personified. In political rhetoric, she became a cautionary tale, what happens when Roman discipline is weakened by foreign influence. Slowly, these descriptions settled into common understanding. They were repeated often enough that they no longer sounded like accusations. They sounded like facts. This is how reputations are poisoned, not by sudden lies, but by steady framing. Each repetition made the next one easier. Each retelling removed a little more complexity. Cleopatra's intelligence, her administrative skill, her diplomatic calculations, none of that mattered once her image had been simplified into something Rome could despise without guilt. And as her image narrowed, her isolation grew. Allies who might have defended her hesitated. Neutral parties distanced themselves. Sympathy became risky. To support Cleopatra was to align oneself with someone Rome had already declared unworthy. Reputation loss is contagious. People back away not because they suddenly agree, but because they fear being pulled down alongside the condemned. Rome understood this instinct well. Delegitimization is not meant to convince everyone. It is meant to make defense uncomfortable. By the time Rome moved militarily, Cleopatra's defeat had already been rehearsed in the Roman imagination. She was no longer seen as a sovereign ruler facing conquest. She was framed as a necessary correction. Her fall was presented not as an act of aggression, but as moral housekeeping. This is the moment where cruelty becomes acceptable. Once a leader is seen as corrupt rather than legitimate, any treatment can be justified. Humiliation becomes reasonable. Erasure becomes practical. Violence becomes administrative. Cleopatra's real danger to Rome was never that she might invade. It was that she ruled successfully outside Roman control, that she embodied an alternative center of power, ancient, wealthy, and unapologetically sovereign. So Rome removed her from the category of equal and placed her into the category of problem. And problems do not deserve mercy. This strategy also protected Rome's conscience. By defining Cleopatra as immoral, Rome could frame its actions as defensive. By calling her dangerous, it could claim necessity. By labeling her foreign corruption, it could rally unity against her. None of this required lies in the crude sense. It required selection, certain traits magnified, certain actions isolated, certain narratives repeated until nothing else was visible. Cleopatra did not vanish from Roman discourse, she was reduced within it, and reduction is a form of violence. Because once a person is no longer seen as fully legitimate, fully human, fully complex, what happens to them no longer needs explanation, it only needs approval. By the time Rome prepared to face Cleopatra directly, it had already ensured that her defeat would feel deserved, that her suffering would not trouble the public conscience, that whatever happened next would feel inevitable. This is how empires prepare the ground. They do not begin by destroying bodies, they begin by destroying meaning. Cleopatra was still ruling, still breathing, still resisting, but in Rome, she had already been decided. And once a reputation is executed, the person rarely survives for long.
Betrayal did not arrive in Cleopatra's court as a single moment of treason. It arrived quietly, almost politely. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Messages were still delivered, advisors still bowed. Orders were still acknowledged. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The space around Cleopatra's authority began to narrow, not through open defiance, but through absence. This is how loyalty collapses under pressure. Rome did not need to openly bribe every ally or threaten every official. Its power alone was enough to change calculations. People began asking different questions in private rooms. Not, is Cleopatra right, but is Cleopatra safe to follow? For those tied to her rule, Egyptian elites, administrators, regional allies, the risk of standing beside her grew heavier with each Roman advance. Supporting Cleopatra no longer meant loyalty to a queen, it meant opposition to an empire. And opposition to Rome had consequences that stretched far beyond the present moment. So hesitation crept in. Requests that once received immediate answers now waited days. Messengers returned without responses. Decisions were postponed, framed as caution rather than refusal. No one announced their disloyalty, they simply became less available. This is the most dangerous kind of betrayal, because it does not look like betrayal at all. Cleopatra would have felt it in the smallest details. A command followed, but without urgency. A report delivered, but lacking clarity. The tone of obedience still present, but its substance thinning. Authority does not vanish overnight. It erodes, grain by grain. Those closest to power often sense this first. Cleopatra had ruled long enough to recognize the signs. When influence is strong, people lean in. When it weakens, they lean away. Rome understood this instinct and relied on it. As Roman pressure intensified, survival became the primary currency.
Egyptian elites began to measure loyalty not by honor, but by outcome. Aligning with Cleopatra no longer promised security, it threatened it. And when safety and allegiance come into conflict, safety usually wins. These decisions were not loud. They were made in whispered conversations, in sealed chambers, in moments when eyes avoided meeting. Each person likely told themselves the same thing: I am not betraying her, I am protecting what remains. But protection often looks identical to abandonment. Cleopatra's world grew quieter, not because she had fewer enemies, but because she had fewer people willing to speak honestly. Fear has a way of muting truth. Advisors soften warnings, courtiers choose neutrality, allies disappear into uncertainty. And Rome watched. The empire did not rush to exploit these fractures, it allowed them to deepen naturally, because isolation is more effective when it feels self-inflicted, when a ruler begins to wonder whether the silence around them is deserved. Cleopatra did not lose her allies because she suddenly became unworthy. She lost them because remaining loyal to her became too expensive. This distinction matters. History often frames betrayal as moral failure, but in moments like this, it is better understood as risk management. People were not choosing Rome because they admired it. They were choosing survival in a world where Rome had made itself unavoidable. And the result was devastating. Cleopatra's authority still existed on paper, her title remained, her commands were still issued, but power is not only what is declared, it is what is carried out, and execution requires belief. As belief faded, her isolation became structural. The court that once amplified her rule now absorbed and softened it. Orders lost momentum, plans stalled, information arrived too late. Each delay tightened the invisible walls around her leadership. This is what betrayal looks like when it is optimized for survival. No knives, no confrontations, no dramatic exits, just a gradual withdrawal of commitment. For a ruler, this is a uniquely disorienting experience. There is no single moment to react to, no clear enemy to confront, only the growing realization that obedience has become conditional. Cleopatra was still obeyed, but less completely, still respected, but less sincerely, still followed, but no longer without question. And by the time this shift becomes visible, it is usually irreversible. Rome did not need to isolate Cleopatra by force, it allowed fear to do the work. By making loyalty costly, it ensured that abandonment would feel reasonable. This is how empires fracture resistance without fighting it directly. When nothing seems to happen, everything is already changing. And by the time Cleopatra stood fully alone, the world around her had already decided that standing with her was no longer worth the risk.
Antony's defeat did not end Cleopatra's resistance, but it altered the conditions under which she could continue. By the time the final reports reached her, the outcome was already irreversible. Actium was lost. The eastern territories that once recognized Antony's authority began recalculating their loyalties. What had been a shared front against Rome fractured into scattered, self-preserving decisions. Yet none of this by itself explains what followed. The true damage came later. Antony's suicide was not merely the death of an ally or a lover. It was the removal of Cleopatra's last emotional equal, the final person who shared both her political burden and her isolation. With his death, something fundamental in her leadership environment collapsed. Cleopatra had ruled alone before, but she had not ruled unsupported. Antony's presence had functioned as ballast, not because he was always reliable, history shows that he was not, but because he absorbed pressure that would otherwise have rested solely on her. His rank, his Roman identity, his shared authority allowed Cleopatra to operate within a partnership that balanced perception as much as power. When Antony died, that balance vanished. What remained was a ruler facing Rome without a counterpart, a queen whose decisions now carried the full weight of defeat, expectation, and scrutiny, without anyone left to share the cost. This is where emotional collapse becomes structural. Cleopatra did not unravel in spectacle. There were no public displays of hysteria, no dramatic gestures meant to provoke sympathy. Instead, the erosion was internal, measured in endurance rather than expression. Leadership, when isolated, becomes heavier in ways that are difficult to explain. Every decision feels final. Every mistake feels personal. Every silence feels like judgment. With Antony gone, Cleopatra's margin for psychological error disappeared. Rome understood this vulnerability and chose not to interfere. Octavian did not rush to capture her. He did not provoke immediate confrontation. He waited. This was not mercy, it was calculation. Rome had already learned that exhaustion is more effective than force, that people under emotional strain make narrower decisions, that pressure applied indirectly is harder to resist because it feels internal. Cleopatra's emotional world shrank. The advisors around her, already hesitant, became more cautious in what they said. Truth softened. Warnings were filtered. Confidence was simulated. Isolation deepened, not because others abandoned her completely, but because they no longer knew how to stand beside her. In this environment, even routine leadership becomes draining. Every choice requires justification. Every plan demands reassurance. Every conversation carries the unspoken weight of impending loss. And without an equal to share that burden, the ruler absorbs it alone. This is what Rome was waiting for. The empire did not need Cleopatra to surrender. It needed her to tire. Antony's death also removed something else, a future that could be imagined. As long as Antony lived, resistance to be framed as partnership, as strategy, as continuation. With his death, resistance became solitary, and therefore finite. Cleopatra was no longer fighting for a shared outcome. She was fighting to delay the inevitable. That shift is psychologically devastating. People can endure extraordinary hardship when they believe in continuity, when they see a path forward, even a narrow one. But when that path closes, endurance becomes obligation rather than purpose. Rome watched as this transition unfolded. Octavian's restraint was deliberate. He allowed time to pass. He allowed Cleopatra to sit with uncertainty. He allowed the absence of Antony to reshape her internal calculations. This patience is often misread as caution. In reality, it was exploitation. By not pressing immediately, Rome ensured that Cleopatra's next decisions would be made under emotional fatigue rather than strategic clarity, that grief, unexpressed and unresolved, would seep into judgment. And this is where emotional collapse becomes politically engineered. Cleopatra was not destroyed by grief. She was worn down by responsibility without relief, by leadership without reinforcement, by survival without hope. Every day she remained alive after Antony's death was a day spent carrying the full psychological weight of an empire's collapse. Rome did not need to accelerate this process. It understood that time was now its ally. Even in victory, Octavian avoided triumph. There were no immediate declarations meant to provoke reaction, no rushed demands. The silence itself was pressure. For Cleopatra, this silence would have been unbearable. Silence forces reflection. It removes distraction. It amplifies fear, and it leaves the mind to fill the gaps with worst-case outcomes. Rome did not shout. It waited. And as it waited, Cleopatra's stability eroded, not because she lacked strength, but because strength has limits when it is never allowed to rest. By the time Rome finally moved closer, Cleopatra was no longer facing it with the emotional infrastructure she once had. The queen who had negotiated, maneuvered, and resisted alongside Antony was gone. What remained was a ruler still standing, but standing alone. And Rome knew that once emotional equilibrium collapses, political collapse soon follows. It did not need to strike her down. It only needed to let gravity finish its work.
Cleopatra was not taken in chains. There were no public displays of force, no violence meant to shock, no visible urgency. Rome had no reason to rush. By this point, Cleopatra was no longer a military threat. She was something else, an asset that needed to be preserved, monitored, and managed. Her survival was intentional. Octavian understood that Cleopatra's value did not end with her defeat. Alive, she could still serve a purpose. She could be displayed, studied, reframed, used. Dead, she would escape all of that, and Rome did not intend to lose control at the final moment. So Cleopatra was kept, under watch that was constant but never crude. The arrangements were formal, respectful in appearance. Guards were present but not aggressive. Communication was permitted but filtered. Movement was allowed but limited. Everything about her situation was designed to appear reasonable. This is how domination becomes suffocating, when it presents itself as order. Cleopatra was still addressed by her title, still housed appropriately, still treated as someone of status, but status without agency is an illusion. Each courtesy was paired with a restriction, each allowance balanced by supervision. Her privacy disappeared first. Every interaction was observed, every message noted. Nothing belonged to her alone anymore, not her space, not her time, not even her thoughts. When a ruler loses privacy, they lose the ability to plan. Reflection becomes performative. Silence becomes suspicious. Rome did not need to interrogate Cleopatra aggressively. It only needed to ensure she was never unobserved. Decision-making followed. Cleopatra could no longer initiate action. She could respond, request, wait. Choices became suggestions. Authority became ceremonial. Even small decisions required approval or delay. Timing, one of the most powerful tools in leadership, was taken from her. Time itself was now controlled by Rome. This is the cruelty of delayed endings. Nothing happens quickly. Nothing concludes. Days stretch without resolution. Questions are answered slowly, if at all. Reassurances are offered but never confirmed. Octavian's representatives spoke calmly. They implied cooperation. They suggested that Cleopatra's future was still open to negotiation. These statements were not promises, they were placeholders. Enough to keep her alive, enough to keep her compliant. Hope in this context was not kindness, it was management. Survival became its own form of pressure. Each morning, Cleopatra awoke to the same uncertainty, not knowing what would be decided, not knowing when, not knowing how much control she still had, or whether any remained at all. This ambiguity was not accidental, it was engineered. Rome understood that fear works best when it lacks shape. A quick execution would have been simple, a clear sentence would have provided closure. Instead, Cleopatra was kept suspended in time, alive but unable to move forward. This condition is psychologically exhausting. Without the ability to act, even strength becomes a burden. A ruler is accustomed to shaping outcomes. When that ability is removed, endurance replaces leadership. Existence becomes maintenance. Cleopatra's body remained intact, her title remained spoken, but her autonomy was systematically dismantled. Every courtesy reminded her of what she had lost. Every polite exchange reinforced that her fate was no longer hers to decide. Rome did not need to humiliate her publicly at this stage. The humiliation was private and therefore more effective. This form of captivity does not rely on suffering that can be seen. It relies on the erosion of self-determination, on the slow realization that survival is no longer living, but waiting. And waiting, under observation, drains resolve. Rome's cruelty lay in its patience. By delaying the final outcome, Rome forced Cleopatra to confront a future defined entirely by others, to imagine herself not as a ruler, but as an object to be processed, a symbol to be displayed, a narrative to be edited.
Being spared in this context was not mercy, it was leverage. Cleopatra remained alive because her death had not yet been scheduled, and as long as it remained unscheduled, Rome retained absolute control. The uncertainty itself was the weapon. This was not confinement meant to restrain the body. It was confinement meant to exhaust the will. And by the time Cleopatra fully understood that survival had become punishment, Rome had already succeeded in owning everything except one final decision. That decision, however, had not yet been made.
Rome did not plan to end Cleopatra's story with death. It planned to end it with display. By the time Octavian's victory was secure, Cleopatra's physical fate was no longer the central question. What mattered now was how she would be remembered, or more precisely, how Rome would teach her memory to others. Empires do not merely conquer territories, they conquer narratives. For Rome, Cleopatra represented a dangerous contradiction. She was a defeated ruler who had once stood as an equal, a woman who had commanded wealth, loyalty, and influence outside Roman authority. Allowing her to die privately would preserve too much dignity. It would leave room for sympathy. It would leave history unfinished. Rome wanted closure, and closure, in Roman terms, meant spectacle. The plan to parade Cleopatra through Rome was not about celebration, it was about instruction. Triumphs were theater, carefully staged rituals designed to communicate hierarchy. They taught the public who ruled, who submitted, and who had been reduced. To be paraded was to be translated into a symbol. In this performance, Cleopatra would no longer be a sovereign queen. She would become an exhibit. Her body would be used to erase her authority, not by denying her existence, but by redefining it. She would be seen, but only as Rome wished her to be seen. This is historical desecration. The destruction of meaning is often more enduring than the destruction of life. A person can die once. A legacy can be distorted forever. Rome understood that humiliation outlives death, that an image once fixed in public memory is difficult to undo. A defeated enemy killed quietly may inspire mourning. A defeated enemy displayed invites ridicule. Ridicule dissolves respect. By planning to display Cleopatra, Rome aimed to strip her of the final protections of sovereignty. Kings who were defeated in battle still commanded a certain dignity. Their fall could be framed as tragic, even noble. Cleopatra was denied this framing. She was to be presented as excess humbled, as defiance corrected. The spectacle would rewrite her story before her life had even ended. This process did not require brutality, it required choreography. Everything about a Roman triumph was deliberate: the route, the order of captives, the symbols carried. Each detail communicated a lesson. Cleopatra's presence would not have been accidental, it would have been central. She would be shown not as a ruler who resisted Rome, but as a cautionary example, a warning encoded into ritual, a visual argument against challenging imperial authority. And once that image entered public consciousness, it would become difficult to dislodge. This is why spectacle is more powerful than execution. Execution removes a body. Spectacle reshapes meaning. Rome's objective was not to eliminate Cleopatra. It was to control what her existence would signify, to ensure that future generations would not see her as a rival to empire, but as proof of empire's inevitability. In this way, history itself becomes occupied territory. Cleopatra's sovereignty was not to be denied outright. It was to be mocked, reduced, reframed as something that never truly belonged to her, in the first place. Rome would present her rule as an aberration, a temporary disorder corrected by imperial order. And this reframing would persist long after her death. The most effective erasure does not involve silence, it involves replacement. Rome did not intend for Cleopatra to be forgotten,
It intended for her to be remembered incorrectly. As a spectacle, Cleopatra's body would speak louder than any defense she could offer. Her presence would be interpreted for her meaning assigned, her history condensed into an image that served Rome's narrative. This is how empires teach obedience without words. The danger of this process lies in its permanence. Once a story is ritualized, it becomes tradition. Once it becomes tradition, it resists correction. Rome understood that controlling memory was the final stage of conquest. And Cleopatra understood this too. She had already been delegitimized, isolated, emotionally exhausted and controlled. Now Rome was preparing to finish the work by deciding how she would be seen by people she would never meet. The violence of this plan lay not in physical harm, but in symbolic annihilation. To be turned into a warning is to lose ownership of one's life story, to have meaning extracted and repurposed, to be remembered not as oneself, but as an argument made by others. Cleopatra had ruled long enough to understand the power of imagery. She had used symbols herself, coins, titles, rituals to assert authority. She knew what it meant when a state took control of representation. Rome was not satisfied with victory. It wanted authorship. And authorship over history is the most complete form of domination. This is the moment where Cleopatra's remaining options narrowed to their final point. Survival, under Rome's terms, meant living as a misrepresentation. Dying on Rome's schedule meant becoming part of its theater. The question was no longer whether Cleopatra would live or die. It was whether she would be remembered as Rome's creation, or whether she would deny the empire that final act. And in understanding this, Cleopatra saw what Rome truly intended to erase. Not her body, her meaning. The final decision now waited just beyond the edge of spectacle.
Cleopatra's final act was neither chaotic nor desperate. It was deliberate. By the time she confronted her remaining options, all visible paths were defined by Rome. Surveillance, delegation, public narrative, and imperial expectation had left her with no meaningful autonomy. Every movement, every message, every interaction was filtered, directed, or observed. And yet, within this complete orchestration of her life by others, one domain remained hers alone: choice over her own death. This was her final frontier. Cleopatra understood the stakes. To live under Rome's terms would mean becoming a symbol stripped of agency. To die, she recognized, was not escape, it was reclamation. It was the last act over which she could assert sovereignty, the final word in a story Rome had tried to write without her consent. Every other avenue had been closed. This one remained. Her decision was strategic, not a flight from reality, but a calculated intervention in the sequence of power. By taking her life, Cleopatra denied Rome its spectacle. She refused to appear as a captive in triumphant parades, refused to let her presence be turned into a moral lesson, refused to allow the empire to script her final image. In this, her suicide was a political act, a ruler's final negotiation with power she could no longer contest. There is no need to dramatize the act. Its potency lies not in spectacle, but in intention. Cleopatra did not scream. She did not make grand declarations. She did not hope for pity. She acted where others had acted to control her, silently, deliberately, and on her own terms. This was a queen reclaiming narrative by the one method Rome could not enforce. Rome, the empire that had so carefully engineered her isolation, the erosion of loyalty, the slow dismantling of her reputation, the strategic management of her survival, and the symbolic erasure of her legacy, found itself confronted with a truth it could not control. Cleopatra could still choose. The apparatus of domination had limits, and in this moment, those limits were exposed. Her death interrupted the story Rome sought to tell. They had planned to display her, to define her meaning in the public eye. Yet, with her own hand, Cleopatra imposed ambiguity. No triumph, no procession, no moralized narrative would fully encapsulate her. Rome could claim the empire, but not the interpretation of her life or the finality of her authority. History, in this sense, is incomplete. And this incompleteness is where Cleopatra's legacy persists. Her sovereignty did not vanish, it transformed. Through her choice, she encoded resistance into the narrative itself. By refusing to be exhibited, she ensured that the story Rome wanted to dominate would always carry the trace of her own agency. The empire may have ruled Egypt, but it did not and could not rule Cleopatra's decision over the terms of her own life. This act reframes power. True authority, Cleopatra demonstrates, does not rest only in armies or titles. It rests in the final decisions that cannot be imposed from outside. Her autonomy, exercised at the moment of death, subverts the entire mechanism of control Rome had so meticulously assembled. Her death, quiet as it was, also acts as a mirror for the observer. It forces reflection on power and control, on the nature of humiliation and its limits. Cleopatra's choice exposes the tension between external authority and internal sovereignty. An empire can dictate circumstance, erode loyalty, and manipulate reputation. It can arrange surveillance, define survival, and choreograph spectacle. But it cannot compel consent in the final, intimate domain. And so, in choosing death, Cleopatra transforms from a historical figure subjected to empire into a statement about the limits of domination. Her act is calculated, final, and strategic. It is political resistance at its most personal. It is narrative reclamation in its purest form. Rome may have gained the world, but it could not gain her story. That story survives precisely because it resisted completion, because it defied the final, controlled image the empire intended to project. Cleopatra's life could be constrained, but her agency, exercised at the last possible moment, was absolute. In contemplating her death, one is left unsettled. History does not provide tidy conclusions. There is no comforting closure. Instead, there is reflection on the nature of power, on the limits of humiliation, and on the subtle ways in which control can be resisted, even when it seems complete. Cleopatra teaches that the most enduring victories are not always those awarded by armies, but those claimed quietly, strategically, and irrevocably. History remembers Cleopatra not because Rome spared her, nor because the empire's machinery failed to kill her body. It remembers her because Rome could not erase her choice. In that refusal, in that deliberate act of reclaiming narrative, she secured a form of immortality more enduring than any parade, more permanent than any execution, more profound than the triumphs Rome had carefully prepared. And that is the final lesson of Cleopatra's life. Even in defeat, even under the most absolute domination, the human will, exercised strategically, can render empires incomplete, narratives unsettled, and memory itself resistant. The empire may have won Egypt, it may have silenced her court, it may have sought to redefine her entirely, but it could not conquer her agency. And in that, Cleopatra remained sovereign, beyond Rome, beyond control, and beyond erasure.